Mr. Whitfield, why are you asking us for $4,000? Priya Anand kept her voice low, but I heard the question land like a dropped plate. Outside the glass wall of her office, a line of customers shuffled forward with deposit slips and umbrellas dripping onto the tile. A radio somewhere played holiday music too cheerful for the gray afternoon. 10 minutes earlier, Priya had been a brisk, polite branch manager glancing over a small home repair loan. Now she had quietly shut her office door and turned the blinds so the lobby couldn't see in. I set both hands on the folder in my lap. Inside were two roofing estimates, the cheaper one just over $4,000. Because half my roof came down in that windstorm last week, I said. I've got a tarp and a prayer holding the rest together. Priya didn't smile. She turned her monitor a few degrees away from the glass. That isn't what I need to ask you about. She tapped the screen once, twice, like she wanted to be sure of what she was reading before she said it out loud. Mr. Whitfield, does the name Ridgeline Family Trust mean anything to you? I shook my head. Never heard of it. You're listed as the sole lifetime beneficiary. She turned the monitor toward me. I saw my name. I saw the last 4 digits of a social security number I recognized as my own. And then I saw a balance with more zeros than I'd ever seen attached to anything with my name on it. $22,108,000. For a second I thought the screen had glitched, that some other Walter Whitfield in some other town was about to have his day ruined by a computer error. I was 68 years old. I'd spent 31 years running the parts counter and then the whole service department at a farm equipment dealership outside town. My Social Security and small pension came to just under $3,800 a month. I clipped coupons out of habit more than need, drove a truck with 210,000 miles on it, and I'd been putting off the roof since October because, according to my son, there wasn't money to spare until the spring bonus came through. That can't be mine, I said. Priya's eyes flicked toward the door, like she was checking it was still shut. The bank absorbed the trust company that administered this account when we merged with Cardinal Fiduciary 18 months ago. Records finished consolidating 2 weeks ago. Your Social Security number triggered a match the moment I ran your loan application this morning. Who controls it? She hesitated. That hesitation told me more than the number on the screen had. My son, I said. It wasn't a question anymore. She nodded, just once. Gary Whitfield is listed as acting distribution advisor under an incapacity provision dated 9 years ago. There's also a corporate co-trustee, but functionally, distributions have required his sign-off. I didn't shout. I didn't ask her to repeat the number. I didn't picture boats or beach houses. I thought about my wife, Doris, 3 weeks before the cancer took her, squeezing my hand and saying, "Don't let the money change who you are to each other." I'd believed for 8 years that there wasn't enough money left to change anybody. Doris's people had a little land in Ohio, some mineral rights nobody paid much attention to. I thought it had all gone into hospice bills and the funeral. I slid the roofing estimates across her desk. Print me everything you're legally able to hand over. There are restrictions on trust records for non-advisors, but as the named beneficiary, you have a right to request an accounting. I can start that process today. Then start it. She studied me for a long moment. Mr. Whitfield, do you have an attorney? Not in about 15 years. Do you have somewhere else you could stay tonight? If you needed to? Something behind my ribs pulled tight. Why would I need that? She turned the screen further and pointed to a line item near the bottom. Not a withdrawal. A notation from the trust's legal correspondence log. Petition for emergency guardianship filed Sumner County Probate Court. Supporting medical documentation submitted by Gary Whitfield. The filing date was that morning. My son had asked a judge to declare me incompetent on the same day I'd walked into a bank to borrow $4,000 for a roof, not knowing he'd been sitting on $22 million of mine for nearly a decade. I closed the folder and stood. My knees were steady, but I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Mrs. Anand, please don't call my son. Bank policy may technically require the trust department to notify the acting advisor when a beneficiary requests records. I'm not asking you to break any law. I'm asking you to follow it slowly. I pulled my old coat off the back of the chair. Something in her face loosened. Just a little. I can do that. I reached the door and looked back at the impossible number still glowing on her screen. And cancel the loan application if you would. She almost smiled. Neither of us found it funny. Mr. Whitfield, she said, this money may be yours. That doesn't mean it's safe. I understand, I told her. I didn't. Not yet. By nightfall, I'd understand that Gary hadn't just hidden a fortune from me. He'd stolen my son-in-law's respect, 7 years with my daughter, and the last clear memory I had of trusting my own judgment. The 22 million was only the paper trail he hadn't managed to erase. Outside, it was 34 degrees and starting to rain again. I sat in the truck with the engine running, watching people come and go through the bank's glass doors, and my first instinct, God help me, was to call Gary. That instinct had been trained into me over years the way you train a dog without meaning to. When the property tax bill looked wrong, I called Gary. When my debit card got declined at the pharmacy, I called Gary, and he'd explain, patient as a schoolteacher, that he'd consolidated some accounts for my protection. He was 41, sharp-dressed, good at his job selling commercial insurance, and better than anyone I'd ever known at making control feel like love. 9 years earlier, 6 weeks after Doris's funeral, I'd been sitting at the kitchen table with a shoebox of unopened mail I couldn't make myself touch. Gary had driven up from the city, sat down across from me, and said, "Dad, you don't need to think about any of this right now. Let me handle it until you're steady again." I'd been so grateful I could have wept. I did weep, actually, right there over a stack of unopened envelopes. Grief had turned ordinary tasks into walls I couldn't see over. I could rebuild a transmission blind, but I couldn't open a bill without the room tilting. I signed a temporary power of attorney at the kitchen table while my daughter, Marianne, stood in the doorway watching, arms crossed, saying nothing. The document was supposed to run 90 days. It never got revoked, and somewhere in that stretch of time, I stopped being consulted and started being informed, and I was so far down inside my own grief that I didn't notice the difference for years. I drove home in the rain instead of calling anybody, and by the time I pulled into my own driveway, I had already decided I wasn't going to sleep that night without answers. Marianne lived 40 minutes away, in a rented house on the edge of Danbury with her husband Colton and their daughter Ruthie, who I hadn't seen in person in going on 7 years. Not because anything terrible had ever been said between us, not that I could remember clean, but because every time I planned to visit, Gary had a reason it wasn't a good idea. Marianne was going through something. Marianne had said things about me that hurt. Marianne didn't want to be around Dad while Dad was still grieving so hard. It wasn't good for either of them. I'd believed him the way you believe a voice that's never once raised at you, the way you believe the child who never makes you feel old or foolish. I sat in my truck outside her house for 10 minutes before I found the nerve to walk up. Marianne opened the door in a paint-stained sweatshirt, and for one long second, neither of us said anything. Then her face did something complicated, relief and fury arriving at the same time, like two trains meeting on one track. "Dad, just that. I need to talk to you," I said. "About Gary. About your grandmother's people's land. About $22 million I didn't know I had until about 3 hours ago." She didn't ask me to repeat myself. She stepped back and let me in. Colton was at the stove. A little girl with Doris's exact chin was coloring at the kitchen table, and she looked up at me with the particular unguarded curiosity of a child meeting someone she's been told stories about but never actually seen. "Are you my grandpa?" she asked. Something in my chest cracked clean down the middle. "Yes, ma'am, I am. Mom has a picture of you fixing a tractor. Most things with an engine I can fix," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I meant it to. Marianne sent Ruthie upstairs with a tablet and a promise of pizza, and then she led me to the small dining table, where within 20 minutes it was covered edge to edge with folders, bank statements, printed emails, certified mail receipts with red refused stamps, photographs, a legal pad filled with dates in her tight handwriting. "You kept all this," I said. "I knew someday it would matter." She didn't look at me. "I just didn't know if you'd still be around to see it." I let that land. I deserved it landing. She opened a folder and slid 2 printed emails across to me. The first appeared to be from her, sent to Gary 2 weeks before Doris passed. "Mom's confused and scared. Get Dad out of the room and get her to sign the mineral rights over to you before she's not able to consent to anything. He'll waste it all if we don't." It was the email Gary had shown me after the funeral, the one that made me stop returning her calls for the better part of a year. Marianne set a second page beside it. "This is the actual message, pulled from my sent folder and verified by the email provider 2 years ago, when I finally got a lawyer to look into it. Gary, Mom is frightened and heavily medicated. Please stop pressuring her to sign anything. Dad needs to be in the room for every decision. and Ruthie's father-in-law should review any legal document before she touches it. I don't care about the mineral rights. I care that nobody is pressuring a dying woman. The timestamp was identical. The wording was nearly identical too, except that key phrases had been reversed, inverted, weaponized. 2 characters different in the sender's address. A forged twin of her real account. He built a look-alike email address, I said. Forwarded doctored messages to himself, and then showed me the fake. I tried to tell you, Marianne said, and her composure cracked for the first time. I tried. She pulled out a certified mail envelope stamped refused, addressed to my house in Gary's handwriting. Returned to sender. Recipient declines. Another. Mailed to the rehab center after I'd had a small stroke 5 years back. Marked. Patient discharged. Though I'd stayed there another 11 days. She showed me phone logs, dozens of calls over 2 years, most lasting under 10 seconds. Gary had put her number on the blocked list of the family phone plan he managed for me. I came by the house 4 times, she said. Once you were resting. Twice nobody answered the door, though your truck was in the driveway. The last time, Gary met me at the end of the drive and told me if I came back he'd call the sheriff and say I was harassing a vulnerable adult. Why'd you stop trying? The anger in her eyes gave way, just for a second, to something more tired. Because I was pregnant with Ruthie and Colton had just lost his job, and every single time I pushed, Gary found a way to punish me for it. He called my supervisor at the school and told her I had a substance problem. He told your sister I was trying to steal from you. I never believed that, I said. You believed enough of it, she said quietly, and I had no honest answer to that. We worked at that table until nearly midnight, Marianne walking me through 9 years of a story she'd assembled alone, while I filled in the blank spaces of the years I'd been too grateful, too tired, too grieving to ask a single real question. The next morning, Marianne, her brother-in-law, who happened to be a paralegal, a careful, quiet man named Desmond, and I met Priya at the bank before it opened to the public. A security guard walked us through a side door to a conference room upstairs, where the bank's trust compliance officer, a heavyset man named Mr. Falcone, laid 3 binders on the table and said something I respected before we'd even started. The failures that happened under the previous fiduciary company are now our responsibility to correct. I want to be straightforward about that. The first binder traced the trust's growth. When Doris's uncle passed, the mineral rights and land had been valued around $4 million. A pipeline company's royalty payments and a decade of a rising market had done the rest. At its peak, the trust held just over $26 million. The second binder showed distributions. Some were legitimate: my property taxes, a chunk of Doris's final medical bills, my modest monthly allowance that Gary called Dad's stipend, as if it were an allowance from him and not a fraction of my own inheritance. But underneath those ordinary payments were others I'd never seen or approved. Harlow Advisory Group had received $1.9 million in management fees. Briarcrest Development had gotten $600,000 as a housing advance. A country club in the city had billed the trust $80,000 in dues under beneficiary wellness services. There were resort charges in Cancun, Aspen, and the Amalfi Coast, all filed under family-supported care travel, while I stayed home eating soup out of a can and putting a tarp on my own roof. How much total? I asked. Mr. Falcone folded his hands. Direct payments tied to Gary or his wife total at least $3.1 million. That figure is likely to grow as investigators dig further. There was also a pending $8 million transaction, the purchase of a boutique hotel property that did not close before your bank visit froze new distributions. How did the co-trustee sign off on any of this? Documentation on file states you were fully incapacitated and under Gary's full-time supervision. Monthly wellness reports were submitted describing assistance with bathing, meal preparation, and cognitive support. Priya slid one across the table. According to those reports, I couldn't be left alone for more than an hour and required daily reminders to take medication I didn't take. On several of the specific dates listed, I now knew for a fact, from my own calendar, that Gary had been in Cancun. Who verified these? Desmond asked. A trust officer named Roland Blakey approved most of the disbursements. He left the predecessor firm 14 months ago. Any relationship to your son? We are examining that. Marianne pointed at a line in one report. It says here Dad moved permanently into Gary's guest house 8 years ago. I stayed there 12 days after my stroke, I said. Then I went home. Mr. Falcone made a note. Our file lists that guest house as your permanent legal address. That afternoon, back at my own kitchen table, Gary called. I almost didn't answer. Desmond had told me not to. I answered anyway. The hotel deal fell through. Gary said, "No hello. No how are you? We lost the deposit." "Whose deposit?" "Mine. My investors. Do you have any idea what you've done? Stopped you from spending $8 million of my inheritance on a boutique hotel. It was going to be worth $20 million in 3 years." He was breathing hard. "Vanessa's brother could go bankrupt over this." "I'm sorry to hear that." "No, you're not. Marianne's turned you into somebody I don't recognize." I looked at Doris's photograph on the counter. "Did you falsify the medical letter that got the guardianship petition filed this morning?" Silence. Gary. "You don't understand what it's like carrying all of this by myself." "That's not an answer. You think this is simple?" "I think it was simple 9 years ago," I said, and hung up before he could say anything else that would make me want to forgive him before I was ready to. The emergency hearing came 4 days later, in a small courtroom that smelled like old carpet and coffee. Gary's lawyer argued that his petition had been filed in good faith, based on medical documentation that was later called into question, and that removing him precipitously would harm the trust's ongoing investments. Desmond argued that a man who could drive himself to a bank, request his own financial records, and articulate a clear timeline of events for a judge was, by any reasonable standard, not incapacitated. Judge Renata Cole took her time. She found substantial evidence I currently possessed full capacity. She also found troubling enough evidence of conflicting medical claims, family estrangement, and irregular trust management that she wasn't willing to simply dismiss the whole matter and move on. She denied Gary's petition for permanent guardianship. Then, out of what she called an abundance of caution for all parties, she appointed a temporary independent guardian for 30 days, not to control my daily life, but to review any major financial or residential decision above $10,000, while a full evidentiary hearing was scheduled on the trust mismanagement itself. Gary looked disappointed for exactly as long as it took his lawyer to lean over and whisper something in his ear. Then relief crossed his face. Because the judge hadn't removed him as distribution advisor outright, that question got kicked to a separate probate hearing weeks away. Outside the courtroom, near the elevators, Gary caught up with me. "You see what she did to me?" he said. "A stranger controlling my father. This is Marianne's doing." "No, son. This is your doing. All of it. You signed the incapacity consent yourself last spring, Dad. If you deny that now, it just proves their point about your memory." Something cold moved through me. "I never signed anything like that." "You did. I have it." "Then it's forged. Same as the letters you sent Marianne." His jaw worked. The elevator doors opened between us before either of us said anything else, and I watched his face disappear behind the closing gap, still certain, even then, that he believed some version of himself where none of this was really his fault. The independent guardian's name was Odalis Ferreira. She came to my house that same evening, checked my medicine cabinet, asked me detailed questions about my finances that I answered without hesitation, and had me make dinner while she watched, the way you'd test a child, except I understood exactly why she had to. I made pork chops and green beans. "Do you usually cook for yourself?" she asked. "When somebody's testing whether I remember how the stove works?" "Yes." She almost smiled. "Fair." Odalis wasn't on anybody's side but the truth's, which meant she was cautious with me too. She took my truck keys pending a routine driving evaluation, asked Desmond to pre-approve any visitors. I'd won the most important part of that hearing and still felt, standing in my own kitchen that night, like a man under house arrest. I had $22 million and no clearance to drive myself to the grocery store. Money wasn't freedom. I understood that now in a way I hadn't at 68 years old, and it embarrassed me that it had taken this long to learn. The story hit the local paper 2 days later. Local retiree's fortune at center of family dispute, with an unnamed source describing me as an elderly man manipulated by an estranged daughter chasing an inheritance, and describing Gary as a devoted son who'd sacrificed years of his own life caring for a confused father. A camera crew parked outside the equipment dealership where I used to work. My old boss called and gently suggested I stay away from the shop floor for a while, just until things settled, and I understood he wasn't wrong to ask, even though it stung. Marianne took it worse. Someone posted her home address online. Her school district put her on administrative leave while they reviewed the situation, even though she hadn't done a single thing besides tell the truth for 9 years running. "I'm sorry," I told her on the phone. "You and Ruthie are paying for choices I made. Stop apologizing and help me end it," she said, and she was right to say it. That was the week the investigation hit its worst stretch. Roland Blakey, the trust officer who'd approved most of Gary's requests, had died of a heart attack 11 months earlier and couldn't testify to anything. Bank archives showed key supporting documents, including the original, questionable incapacity letter had been destroyed under a routine digitization policy. The digital copy existed, but not the physical original or its transmission record. The doctor whose name appeared on that letter had retired and moved to Portugal. His old office had no record of ever treating me, but records that old had been purged years before. We had the money trail. We didn't have proof of who had actually forged the signature that started it all. Then Gary's lawyer filed a motion accusing Marianne and Desmond of coaching me, pressuring an elderly man to rewrite his estate plan against his own interests. Odalus, cautious as ever, asked me to sign nothing further except through independent counsel until the full hearing. That night, sitting at my own kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, I remembered something. A yellow sticky note, years old, that I'd found tucked in an old recipe box of Doris's the week after she died and never thought twice about. I'd assumed it was a grocery list. I found it in a drawer I hadn't opened since the funeral. In Doris's handwriting, "Ask Uncle Ray's old lawyer about G's proposal. Tell Marianne everything. Together. No side meetings." "What proposal?" Marianne asked. When I called her, my hands not quite steady, she went quiet on the other end. Then, "I remember something. About 6 months before Mom got sick, Gary wanted her to move the mineral rights into some kind of investment partnership he was setting up. She said no. She thought it borrowed against itself too heavily. Would she have written anything down? Mom kept everything. She was terrified of losing photos of Ruthie as a baby. She had this backup habit she'd load everything onto those little hard drives every Sunday night. I remembered the small black drives, still boxed up with her old camera in the hall closet, untouched in 8 years because I couldn't bring myself to go through them. Odalus had to approve it. But that evening, with Desmond standing beside me, I opened the box. 3 drives, wrapped in one of Doris's old dish towels. 2 held photographs' birthdays, Ruthie as an infant, our whole marriage in thumbnails. The 3rd was password protected. Doris's birthday. Wrong. Our anniversary. Wrong. The password hint read, "The safest thing we ever bought." I typed in the address of the little cabin on the lake we'd paid off free and clear the year before she got sick. The one thing in our life that had never once felt uncertain. The drive opened. Inside, a folder labeled simply G, scanned documents, emails, and an audio file dated 7 weeks before Doris died. I pressed play, rustling, a chair scraping, then Doris's voice, thin but unmistakably hers. "I'm recording this because I'm tired of being told later that I misunderstood." Gary's voice, younger, impatient. "Mom, nobody's saying you misunderstood. You want me to move Uncle Ray's rights into your partnership while your father's out getting groceries. It's family money. Grandpa Ray would want it working, not just sitting there. Your father will manage it fine. Not once you're gone. He won't. Marianne will try to control everything and Dad won't be able to stop her." A long pause. Then Doris, every word deliberate. "If you ever use my death to make your father feel like he can't stand on his own, you will lose a great deal more than this money. You will lose him." The recording ended. Nobody at that table moved for a long moment. Doris had named exactly what Gary would do, years before he did it, and named exactly what it would cost him. Desmond made 3 copies of that drive before sunrise. One to his office safe, one to the bank's forensic team, one to O'Daly's, who logged every hand it passed through. Gary's attorney immediately argued the recording was ambiguous, that a dying woman's private conversation 8 years ago proved nothing about my current mental state. He was right about one narrow thing. The recording alone didn't prove a single dollar had moved illegally, but it changed the shape of everything else. It meant Gary's plan hadn't started with my grief. It had started before my grief even existed, waiting for its opening. The bank's forensic team found one more thread. Roland Blakey, the deceased trust officer, had received what internal records called a professional development advance of $140,000 from Briarcrest Development, the same shell company that had billed the trust for a housing advance 18 months before he approved Gary's first major distribution. The loan was never repaid. It simply vanished from Briarcrest's books. "That's a bribe," I said. "It has the appearance of an undisclosed conflict of interest," Mr. Falcone said carefully. "Investigators will make that determination." Blakey had overridden 3 separate automated compliance flags in the system, each time closing them with the identical note. "Advisor confirms continuing incapacity. Beneficiary contact would cause distress." Gary's electronic signature sat beside every one. The trust committee suspended Gary that same afternoon. A senior fiduciary at the bank took over as temporary advisor. By evening, a detective from the county's financial crimes unit had called Desmond directly. The case wasn't just a probate dispute anymore. It was a criminal one. I should have felt something like triumph. Instead, I stood at my own kitchen sink with my back to the room and just breathed for a while. "Dad?" Marianne said. "When Gary was 7, I said, he took $2 out of Doris's coat pocket and bought candy for every kid on the block. When we caught him," he cried, "because he genuinely believed being generous with it made the stealing all right. We made him earn the money back doing chores and return what candy he still had," Doris told him. "A kind reason doesn't clean dirty hands." Marianne didn't say anything. "I thought he understood that," I said. "I don't know where I lost him." "You didn't make him do this." "No. But I let him believe being needed made him entitled to whatever he wanted. And I let you believe that being the one who told the truth made you disposable." I turned around. "I'm sorry for that. That doesn't give me back 7 years with Ruthie's grandfather," she said, but her voice had gone soft around the edges. "It doesn't give her back a childhood with you in it." "No," I said, "it doesn't. I know that." She came and stood beside me at the sink, and for a while neither of us said anything else, and it was the first quiet that had felt like peace instead of avoidance in longer than I could remember. 3 months later, in a different courtroom, Gary's wife, Vanessa, took a plea deal, conspiracy, and falsifying financial records, after investigators showed her text messages coordinating fake wellness reports with a home health aide who'd never once actually visited my house. Her cooperation shortened her sentence. It didn't erase it. She served 8 months in county custody, followed by supervised probation and a restitution order. Gary held out longer. His lawyer kept arguing that Blakey had designed the scheme and Vanessa had executed it, that Gary himself had simply trusted the professionals around him. Then the forensic team recovered a deleted early draft of the falsified medical letter, buried in an old backup from Briarcrest's own servers. The metadata carried Gary's login credentials in the revision history. He pleaded guilty 3 weeks before trial. The judge sentenced him to 26 months in federal custody on wire fraud and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, followed by supervised release and a restitution order that would take him years, maybe the rest of his working life, to satisfy. Online, in the comments under the news article, people argued about whether that was enough. Some said, "Far too light, a sentence for 9 years of a man's stolen life." Others said I should have found a way to save my own son before it ever got this far. None of them had sat across from him at 7 years old, watching him hand back candy to kids on our street with his chin trembling. None of them had heard Doris tell him, gently but without any give in it at all, exactly what he stood to lose. I wrote to him once a month after that. I never sent money beyond what the facility allowed for books and phone time. I never called anyone to ask for special treatment. My letters were about ordinary things: the weather, how the truck was running, Ruthie's first lost tooth, the maple tree in the backyard that finally had to come down after the last storm. For 5 months, he didn't write back. Then a letter came. "Dad, I've started this letter maybe a dozen times, and every version turns into an excuse. Mom got sick. The business felt shaky. Blakey made it feel like a loophole instead of a theft. Marianne always had it easier with you. None of that made my hand sign your name to anything. I told myself at first I was just borrowing authority, that I'd give it all back once I got ahead. Then I liked being the one everyone had to ask permission from. I don't expect you to forgive this. I wanted you to know I finally understand you were never the one in our family who needed protecting. I was. I read that letter 3 times at my kitchen table. Then I put it in the same drawer where I kept Doris's yellow sticky note. Not because the two pieces of paper carried equal weight, but because both of them, finally, held nothing but the truth. Marianne and I rebuilt slowly, the way you'd rebuild anything worth keeping, not with one grand gesture, but with Sunday dinners, with me learning Ruthie's school schedule, with me sitting in the third row at her second-grade music program clapping too loud on purpose so she'd hear me over everybody else. I didn't hand Marianne a check and call the debt paid. Some weeks we talked about the lost years. Most weeks we didn't, and that was fine too. With independent counsel, I rewrote my estate plan so that no single person would ever again hold that much control over another person's life, no matter how much I loved them or how much I believed I could trust them. Marianne remained a beneficiary. Gary's share of Doris's family trust was permanently forfeited, but I left him a modest education account for any grandchildren he might someday have, and a box of family photographs, because I wasn't ready to erase him, only to stop handing him power he'd already proven he couldn't be trusted with. With the trust's help, I started something I called the Doris Whitfield Fund, seeded with $2 million to pay for free independent legal reviews for older folks facing questionable guardianship petitions or family members who'd quietly taken over their finances. Priya joined the advisory board. O'Dolly's trained the volunteers to ask one question before anything else. What does this person actually want? I finally fixed the roof that spring, even though the tarp had held fine all winter, because I didn't want to keep living under a reminder of the day everything cracked open. It cost just under $5,000. I paid it myself, out of my own account, and kept the receipt in a folder with my name on it, nobody else's. Then I did something Doris would have called ridiculous and loved anyway. I bought an old aluminum fishing boat, nothing fancy, just enough for 3 people and a cooler, and had a friend paint Doris's objection on the side in careful letters. Marianne laughed so hard the first time she saw it that Ruthie asked what was funny, and I told her it was a joke between me and her grandmother, one she'd started years before either of us understood how much it would matter. A year after the courthouse, Priya asked me to speak to a room of new loan officers at the bank. I didn't tell them how to spot every kind of fraud people trained for that could do it better than I ever could. I told them what it felt like to be the man across the desk. Don't assume an old coat means somebody's poor, I said. Don't assume a big account number means somebody's free. And if a family member answers every question before the older person gets a chance to, find a polite way to ask to hear it from them directly, alone, even if it takes an extra 5 minutes. A young officer afterward asked me what I thought would have happened if that windstorm had never taken the roof. I've turned that question over more times than I can count. Maybe I'd have found out eventually some other way. Maybe the bank merger would have flagged it on its own, a year or 2 down the road. Or maybe Gary would have moved me into that guest house permanently before I ever thought to ask a single hard question, and I'd have spent whatever years I had left being cared for by people paid with my own money, while my son explained to anyone who asked that his father simply didn't understand finances anymore. A $4,000 roofing loan didn't save me on its own. Priya closing her office door and asking one more question did. Marianne's refusal to throw away 9 years of evidence did. Doris's sticky note and her hidden recording did. And somewhere in there, my own willingness, finally, at 68 years old, to admit that loving someone didn't require me to stop looking at what he'd actually done. On the 1-year anniversary of the sentencing, Marianne, Ruthie, and I took Doris's objection out onto the lake. The morning was cold and clear, a thin mist sitting just above the water the way it does in early spring. Ruthie held the fishing rod like it was the most important job in the world. Marianne poured coffee from a thermos into 2 mismatched mugs. "Grandpa," Ruthie said, "Mom says you're rich." Marianne nearly choked on her coffee. "That is not exactly what I said." I laughed, really laughed, for what felt like the first time in a year. "Your mother's right, sweetheart. Just maybe not for the reason you're thinking." Ruthie frowned at that, working it over. "Do you still have all that money?" "Something close to it." "Then why's your truck still so old?" "Because it still starts," I said. "And because money's a tool, not a boss. The second you let it start giving the orders, it makes every decision worse." Marianne looked out over the water. "That sounds exactly like something Grandma would have said. Most of my good ideas do," I told her, and meant it. Ruthie's line jerked, and she shrieked and started reeling with everything her small arms had in them. The fish that came up wasn't much bigger than my hand, but she held it up like she'd pulled a whole world out of that lake, and for a moment, watching her, I understood something Doris had tried to tell me years before I was ready to hear it. Peace was never going to be a locked door, or a quiet argument nobody wins, or a lie the whole family quietly agrees not to look at too closely. Peace was just being able to sit inside your own life again, without asking anybody's permission first. I still loved my son. Some mornings that love felt exactly like grief. Some evenings it felt, unexpectedly, like hope. I was learning that forgiveness wasn't a door I had to force myself through before I was ready. It was more like a road, one I could walk at my own pace, without carrying the whole weight of him on my back the entire way. Marianne and I would never get those 7 years with Ruthie back. We could only decide not to lose the next 7. The money had paid for lawyers and a new roof and a fund with Doris's name on it, and chances I'd never have imagined for myself at 68. But the thing that actually mattered, the thing no accountant could ever put a figure on, was smaller than all of that, and worth more than all of it combined. It was my own voice, the same voice my son had once described to a judge as confused. The same voice I'd quieted for years just to keep the peace in a house that was never really peaceful at all. The same voice that finally told a courtroom, a bank, and my own child, plainly and without apology, that I was still here, and I still got a say in my own life. As we turned the boat back toward shore, I thought about that first question in Priya's office, the one that started all of it. Why are you asking us for $4,000? At the time, I thought I was there to fix a roof. I had no idea I was about to get my whole life back.